Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast. And joining me is one of my favorite draft experts, Joe DeLeone, co-host of the First Team podcast with the Bleav Network, covering everything about the NFL draft. It's always good to have you, Joe. And my, how things have changed for the Texans since you and I spoke last year.
Yeah, of course. We were saying that before we started taping here, and I always appreciate you having me on, Robert. Of course, it's crazy how the past couple times I've come on the show and we've talked about this roster building approach and how the Texans are going to right the ship and get in this position to back to winning the AFC South on a consistent basis. And it's unbelievable. We look at all these other teams this past free agency and this past draft process. Everyone wants to replicate what the Texans did, that they were able to become an immediate contender. And now in year two for CJ Stroud and DeMeco Ryans and Will Anderson and this really budding franchise and roster, there's so much potential. And this year's draft could give them another opportunity to just continue bolstering that roster.
Yeah, let's move right into that because I need to know, what's your take on the Texans trading their first round pick, the value in the Vikings package as well? And what about moving back from 23 to 42? What does that mean in this draft?
Yeah, I will say, I don't think that it's a lopsided trade. I think that it's relatively fair. I just don't love the idea of trading out of the first round. If there is a draft to do, it's this one. The 2024 NFL draft is extremely deep, and who you're going to get at pick 23 is not that far off from who you're going to get at pick 42. There's just a really nice grouping of guys in the back end of the first all the way into the second round that are potential impact starters for most franchises. It does start to really thin out in the later rounds, but that's why I don't think that this trade really necessarily hurts them. It feels a little weird for me, and it doesn't sit super great moving out of the first round. That being said, though, any opportunity that you have when you're a team like the Texans that are trying to continually improve the roster and then fill these last remaining holes in order to get to the position where they're not just the fun young team and instead they're one of the best teams in the NFL, they need draft capital and they need early draft capital. So for them to pull out of this with a bunch of extra picks for this upcoming draft and where they're going to be sitting, I think it's very helpful for them. They have the opportunity to bolster their defensive line and to figure out the linebacker position, add a little bit more to their secondary. I think that this decision and this move was the right one for the Houston Texans because they're trending in the right direction and additional picks are always going to help.
Yeah, one of the things that I loved about it, Joe, and I don't know where you fall on this, but I feel like the positions that the Texans have left themselves of need in this draft are perfect for moving back because those positions are deep in this particular draft.
Yeah, so that's the even bigger reason why I look at what the Texans would have needed at pick 23. And the one that always kept coming back for me was maybe them drafting an edge rusher, but more importantly, an interior defensive lineman. And certainly they could have hoped that Jer'Jon Newton from Illinois would have been on the board, who is in a separate tier amongst these defensive tackles. There's a tier break, but the tier break has so much talent in the second round, in the third round, and even in the fourth round. Guys like Michael Hall Jr., Brandon Dorlus is a guy that I like, Chris Jenkins from Michigan. There's just all of these really good options for them that they couldn't take at 23. So for what they'd be looking to go get in their interior defensive line, it makes a little bit more sense for them to come back around and do it in the second round. And I'd also add in there, it brought up linebacker. They're in this spot where they could come back and try to plug in a young linebacker from this draft class. And there's none that are worth taking in the first round, but there's plenty that are worth taking on day two. So now they're placed nicely to take a Peyton Wilson from NC State, a Junior Colson from Michigan, or an Edgerrin Cooper from Texas A&M. I think that for what they need and their needs, it's going to be a little bit more beneficial for them.
Yeah, I want to circle back and zero in on some of these positions, but how do you feel about their free agency, adding Hunter, Autry, Alshire, Mixon, while losing Grenard, Rankins, Collins, and Cashman?
For what they did and the moves that they made are acceptable. It feels like they kind of stayed the same in terms of some of these additions and swap outs that they made. Losing Rankins and Cashman to me, I think are two of the more, not alarming, but two losses that you don't want to see when they were really impactful players for your defense this past year. But Cashman played his best season for the Texans in 2023. So to lose out on him and to have to really go back to the drawing board at linebacker, and you don't really have a lot of great options. Like I look at them drafting Henry To'oTo'o last year, and I don't know if he can ever get to the point where he's up to the expectations that we once had for him. On top of that, though, Rankins was a menace. He was so hard to keep up with. So to now, again, have to go back to the drawing board. You don't really have a lot of great options on the roster. That certainly isn't great. I will say I do like and appreciate going after somebody like Joe Mixon, because having a veteran running back who has been truly very productive is only going to help a guy like CJ Stroud improve and continue to get better. That was one of the moves that maybe wasn't loved by many, but I think could be a strong move for this offense to just get a little bit better and put them in a better position to run the football.
Yeah, the other thing about losing Cashman, you trade out Cashman for Alshire. I think the reasoning behind that is Alshire might be not only better, but healthier. Cashman's had a lot of health issues. But, you could use 3 linebackers, you would think. But I guess that's the thing, Joe, is I don't know if there's real value in having a really good third linebacker. And they've got Christian Harris, who really came on this year. It's funny because I was looking back at what you and I were talking about. That was one of your least favorite from that Texans draft was Christian Harris.
Missed on that one.
With Harrison, with Harrison Alshire, I mean, those guys are going to be taking up most of the downs. And it's basically like the other guy would have been the first and second, the other guy that they need is the first and second down. So they could use a linebacker for sure. They need a third linebacker. They need somebody else that you're okay with having out on the field. There was a lot of Denzel Perryman, which, he was not that great. So yeah, I guess that's the feeling. And that's probably something that you have to look at. I'm sure when you're evaluating with some of these teams is third linebacker has become maybe not something that teams really value that much. If they got 2 good ones, then that's good.
Yeah. I would kind of take this a little bit deeper that having a will backer, like a good will backer is something that's, I think, overlooked a lot with roster building. And sometimes these teams just try to see what they can grab in the later rounds. And I would argue that I look at the linebacker core that the Ravens had in 2023, the way that they were able to be so productive and the production from their linebackers, I think was a huge reason why their defense was so good. In addition, obviously Kyle Hamilton exploding this season, but having good linebackers is overlooked, I feel like, in the modern age of football. So there is potential with some of these guys that I brought up that I think could be nice day 2 picks for them to really round out that linebacker room.
Right now, the Texans have 3 picks in the top 86. Before we name names, what positions would you prioritize with these top 3?
Yeah, I think the biggest priority has to be finding some disruptive interior defensive linemen because, we talked about the loss of Sheldon Rankins. That's going to be really difficult to replace. I think that has to be, a critical, important replacement for them. Again, I still think that will backer spot is something that they could potentially address. And then I would argue that it doesn't hurt to add a developmental right tackle in order to provide some competition for Titus Howard because he has not exactly come together to the way that I think Texans fans would have hoped. So to add a developmental guy that can play some depth and then maybe step in at a certain point when you decide to move on from Howard would be strong for the Texans to do in this draft.
Positions of need, you mentioned some of the ones that you think. Do you agree that wide receiver, cornerback, and defensive tackle are the strengths of this draft?
Yes, absolutely. I think that wide receiver absolutely is because there's just so many options that are going to spill all the way into day 3. And then not only is there a lot of guys that could be really good primary and secondary options, there's a lot of different body types that can play different roles depending on what a team needs. So for the Texans, they've already got a really good receiving room. They're capably able to add some more depth and keep this offense flowing as potently as it possibly can. Defensive back, corner specifically, safety's not great in this year. Cornerback has very similar to wide receiver, a lot of different body types, a lot of different play styles that are going to be capable to step in and start day 1. And the defensive tackle, I'll say, is a little bit more deep. It just doesn't have any premier talent at the top, which in modern football, we typically don't go after defensive linemen the way that we used to. They're just not as highly prioritized as we've seen in the past, which is why I think it's a little bit more fitting that most of these guys, we can see a long run of them go somewhere in the 2nd and 3rd round.
If Caserio wants a defensive tackle, is it best to take one at 42 where he's at right now because of the depth at other positions of need? Or is there a particular position that you think the Texans should prioritize because if you wait too long, it drops off?
I think in general for a team like the Texans, they're in this position to just approach things as best available. They don't need to, think to themselves and feel rushed that they don't want to miss out on anything. I will say that there's definitely value in having first choice of picking which defensive tackle you like the most outside of that, that tier break, as I'm mentioning after Jerjon Newton, that you could prioritize taking McKinley Jackson from Texas A&M or Michael Hall Jr. as the second defensive tackle to be selected, or Byron Murphy from Texas could certainly still be on the board. I think that there's certain value in that, in being able to take the best one available that you like the most.
Which receivers do you like? Because that has been a big conversation with Texans fans. They want another guy. Who do you believe might be available for the Texans in the 2nd or 3rd round?
Yeah, as we start to get into day 2, there's a lot of explosive options that get overlooked. One guy that I really love is Jalen Polk, who is so fluid. He's so flexible. He's a great route runner. His long speed is good enough. And I think that if there's somebody on day 2 that develops into a 1,200-yard receiver on a consistent basis, I think it's Jalen Polk from Washington. I think Xavier Legette from South Carolina has like this DK Metcalf build where he's so big and physical, the way that he's put together. He still has elite long speed running in the 4.3s. And I think that he's got that profile that I don't know if necessarily fits with what the Texans need, because you kind of already have that type of receiver with Nico Collins. I also like some guys like Ladd McConkey, who's going to be a great slot receiver in the NFL. Xavier Worthy, he might end up in the first round. He might end up in the second round, broke the 40-yard dash record at the NFL Combine, is going to be a ridiculous deep threat in the NFL. And then I'd also throw in there, I really like Jermaine Burton from Alabama, whose usage was really strange because of the way that the offense was built at Alabama, because Jalen Milroe's throwing consistency was all over the place. But Jermaine Burton could be a strong little piece that you add in there as your fourth receiver. That's just a nice field stretcher amongst the group.
Before I get your thoughts on the corners available in the draft, I'd like to get your take on the 2 former top 10 cornerbacks that the Texans signed in free agency, Jeff Okudah and CJ Henderson. Any idea what happened there? Were those guys that you were particularly high on? Does it surprise you what's happened to their careers?
CJ Henderson's not that surprising to me, because coming in, he was considered to be really raw and really crabby, and that's been the problem that he's encountered this whole time. Jeff Okudah has been really strange, because I don't think there was really anybody who thought that he wasn't going to pan out, or really thought that he wasn't going to work, just because he was so well-rounded. And I think that the one aspect that's held back Okudah is just improper situations, not really placed in a spot where he could develop and hone his skills. There was a little bit more technical improvements that needed to happen, and just hasn't really clicked for him. I will say, I think that there's a lot of promise for both of these guys. And I think it's a good strategy. Caserio is going after this approach that we've seen Bill Belichick do in the past, that at the very beginning of his time handling the roster building for the Patriots didn't work so much at the end, but at the beginning of his time would go and get these former first round picks and then try and get whatever else he could out of them when they've hit their bottom, their floor of what their capabilities were. And the most notorious one's Randy Moss. He turned him into a star again after he had bottomed out for a period of time on multiple teams. So for the Texans to get these toolsy guys and to throw them into this defense, I think is going to really pay off some dividends, because all you need is one of them to work out. You don't need both of them.
Yeah. So this leads me to the next question, of course, is which cornerbacks could be available in the second or third round? Who do you like? My feeling is you can't have too many good cornerbacks, and Stingley has got a long history of being not always reliably healthy.
Yeah, I think that particularly for the Texans' needs, I'd love for them to attack bolstering their slot corners. There's 2 guys that stand out to me. One's more of a slot safety than a corner, but Javon Bullard, such a really consistent tackler, and he looks really good in coverage. I really like Kalen Carson from Wake Forest, who can play outside, he can play inside. He is another guy who's a really strong tackler, really good ball skills. Not the biggest corner prospect, but he's got really, really good ball skills. And he played really good against Keon Coleman when he faced off with Florida State this season. I'd also, another guy I'd throw in there for day 2, DJ James from Auburn, is a really rangy athlete that's super raw. He's still developing and still kind of working on a couple of things and needs to be coached up and improved. But as you're talking about here, you've got this good unit. You take DJ James in the 3rd round, you can add him to the back end of your depth of the group. And then as he comes along, eventually maybe he takes over for Okudah or Henderson once the Texans decide to move on from one of them.
We all know running backs have been devalued by the modern NFL, but safeties, kind of the same category, as you can tell by free agency. And I believe the Texans safety group might be the biggest weakness of all the positions, with an injury-riddled Jimmy Ward and a semi-bust so far in Jalen Petrie. Are there guys you like at safety in the middle rounds?
Yeah, well, the good thing for any desire to draft any safeties is that all of them are going to be available in the middle rounds. I don't think anyone could even come off in the top 50 picks because of just the struggles of some of the top guys throughout this pre-draft process. The real prize amongst the group is Cam Kitchens. From Miami, he didn't test that well at the NFL Combine, but he's the most instinctive. He's got the best ball skills. He is just so reactive and natural at the position, and could turn into one of these ball hawking safeties that becomes really productive as a 2nd or a 3rd round pick. Outside of that, though, I really don't love the class. I mean, there's nobody that I'm really coming to the table with here and pushing. Really a much later guy that I think could pan out and be a really good safety prospect is Daquan Hardy, a slot corner safety, kind of a hybrid player who, similar to the Kalen Carson and Javon Bullard that I brought up, really good tackler, very, very explosive athlete, and also a really good kick returner if the Texans wanted to go that route and add him into the mix.
The Texans have a couple of pretty good pass-catching tight ends in Schultz and Jordan. Ideally, you'd love to find a combo tight end, but the best hope is finding a blocking tight end later in the draft, because we talked about there's going to be other priorities earlier on. Is there somebody between rounds, say 4 and 7, who might help as a blocking tight end?
Cade Stover's the first guy that comes to mind. He is funny to really project because you watch him on tape and he does everything right. He's a really hard-nosed blocker. He's not afraid to get his nose dirty. He's got really nice technique, really good leg drive. He's got pretty consistent hands too. Like if the ball's thrown his way, he's going to come down with it. He runs his routes effectively. He's just not a great athlete. He's not a very explosive or rangy athlete, which could benefit the Texans if they're looking for that third tight end. I would feel, though, with the fact that they have Brevin Jordan and they have Schultz, as you mentioned, I feel like it would be a massive luxury to draft somebody like Cade Stover from Ohio State. But that would be the first guy that comes to mind because, frankly, this class doesn't have a lot of good blockers. It's got a lot of really good receivers, not a lot of good blockers this year.
Yeah, that's too bad. You mentioned linebackers. Who would you like? I kind of don't get the sense that they're desperate for one, so I don't see it in round 2. But maybe a 3rd round, 4th round linebacker that you feel like could work for the Texans.
Yeah, a couple of the guys that really popped to me late on day 2, early on day 3. I really am a big fan of Tyron Hopper from Missouri. A little bit of a more leaner, more compact guy, but he is the prototypical will that we look for in the NFL that could slide into that role for the Texans defense because he's so rangy, he's so fast. He's the perfect cleanup guy, just knows the right angles of where he needs to be the one who navigates all the traffic and finishes off a play. I like Cedric Gray, but his instincts are all over the place. They're very inconsistent. He is from UNC. He is somebody who is also very strong in pass coverage. And then Tyrese Knight from UTEP is one of the more underrated small school guys in this class who just does everything right. His decision-making is inconsistent because there's some games where you watch him and he's flowing to the football super easily. And then there's other times where he is emptying gaps and leaving wide open rushing lanes for opposing offenses. But I really like Tyrese Knight. Could be a nice day 3 pick that pans out if the Texans took him.
It's funny you mentioned right tackle because the Texans fans have been frustrated with the fact that Titus keeps being moved into guard. Last year, it was by necessity with the injuries. And, under the previous administrations, they kept moving him around. It's just like, leave the guy at right tackle. He's not a good guard. He's been really solid at right tackle. I don't know if they draft a tackle. More likely, I think, Joe, because Kenyon Green is still such a big question mark, I could see them drafting a guard. I kind of doubt it because they do like Jared Patterson. They do like Juice Scruggs, and either one of those guys could play guard. But is there a guard maybe that is a 3rd or 4th round option, or am I crazy to think that they might be looking at a guard with Kenyon Green's question marks?
Yeah, one guy that comes to mind early day 3 that could certainly still be on the board. I like Bo Limmer from Arkansas. Good flexibility, good power profile, all over the place in terms of his consistency. He, for me, would make sense for the needs that you just painted here for the Texans because he has experience playing center. He has experience playing guard. He comes from a coaching staff at Arkansas that prioritizes offensive line play. So he's going to show up with the right mentality and the physical approach to the position that you're looking for from an interior offensive lineman. So I like that idea of Bo Limmer because I know that he could come in and play multiple roles because of what he was called upon and asked to do so when he was at Arkansas.
All right. So here's the deal. You have been coming on the show the last 2 years. And I remember your one frustration with the Texans 22 draft was that they traded down when they could have drafted Kyle Hamilton. You liked Green. You loved Hamilton. So far, you nailed that idea. But Joe, I just wanted to look back at what you said about CJ Stroud. This is a little over a year ago.
It does become concerning with CJ Stroud from Ohio State is that being an Ohio State quarterback, you're not asked to make a lot of decisions. There are a lot of limitations on what is required of you reading a defense, looking at what's in front of you. And this is part of the reason why I have Bryce ahead of him is that Bryce is actually asked to read a defense, go through his progressions. We have seen times where CJ has overthought things, not really know where to take the football, and he has still tried to force it into one of his initial reads. That decision making needs to be worked on. And again, it's something that we talk about every single year with these Ohio State quarterbacks that is a concern. And that's something that's not going to be figured out until he gets to the NFL. It's something that is going to take him being thrown into the water to determine if he is going to be able to take that next step. It's not going to happen in the next few weeks at Ohio State. And it didn't happen at all this season at Ohio State because he wasn't asked to do anything differently.
Is there a big drop between Bryce and CJ?
No, I don't think so. Just because of their differences. If we're grading purely off of talent, CJ Stroud is ahead of Bryce Young. If we're grading purely off of processing ability and awareness and composure, Bryce Young's ahead of him. This is a 1A, 1B situation. It just purely depends on what a team is working for and what they're dealing with. I think that Bryce fits better for a team that might be more properly positioned to win sooner.
That sounds about right. That sounds. I mean, I wasn't far off in what I was saying there, because the last little bit's a little bit of an indictment on me, because my thought originally was that CJ Stroud might need a little bit more time. It just so happens, though, what makes it so strange to look at these two guys, because they're going to be forever compared. Bryce got thrown to a spot where the roster is just horrible, and it's such a mismanaged franchise, and he might not pan out because it's going to take forever for them to put together a roster that's competitive enough for him to really be good. But that's interesting. I mean, I guess that's kind of what I feel like that's come to fruition relatively for the most part, because talking about how he's got the more talent, he's the more talented player, and he was set up and asked to just go out there and ball and play naturally, and he did exactly that, and to stop thinking so much. That was what I think what the big thing was for Stroud.
Yeah, no question. You were not down on Stroud, but he was sort of underestimated by everybody, and evaluating these quarterbacks appears impossible. Is there anything you've changed or you think you're learning about quarterback evaluation?
No, I've used CJ Stroud as a nice barometer for Drake May in the way that I've really been pushing him. I think that what's made CJ Stroud so successful is that the offensive system at Ohio State wasn't really the best for him. And I think that because he was so successful early on with the Texans, we saw he was just really kind of thrown out there and asked to just go ball. Don't overthink this. Don't over analyze everything that's going on. Just go be yourself. He's one of the most natural quarterback prospects that we've had come out in the past 4 or 5 years. And he played to that level. And I keep bringing this up with Drake May, and it's very reminiscent too of Justin Herbert, where we overthink these things. We start to get worried. Like, does he have the demeanor? Does he have the on-field decision-making? But if we just pay attention to the natural playmaking ability, that to me is the most important thing for a quarterback. So like, I'm always going to come back to that when we're presented these guys. I'd rather have Drake May over JJ McCarthy, because one has shown more natural ability to take over a game than the other. CJ Stroud took over the game against Georgia. That should have been what everybody paid attention to. That was the clear indication of the ceiling of what he could have become. And he's played exactly like that for the Texans.
Yeah. And just to be clear, that was done in November. You came on with me again in April, I think, or early May, right before the draft. And I looked at both clips and they were very similar. You said similar things even after the Ohio State game. But again, you weren't down on CJ. I think there was just a lot of unknowns there. And, that's the deal. Like, when you look at this quarterback draft, how many guys do you think are legit? I mean, we know that probably the top 3 are off the board are going to be right 1, 2, 3 or something like that.
I think that the top 3 are the most likely to be legit, which is Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May. There, to me, have the requisite traits that you're looking for in a quarterback who can play early. Caleb Williams is so good at improvising. He's just so natural. Drake May, again, very natural, but needs to be kind of reeled in on his erratic decision-making sometimes. And then Jaden Daniels is just, he's the next coming of Lamar Jackson. He's an unbelievable athlete with some of the things that he's been able to do. So maybe if the passing isn't there, he can be like Lamar in his first season, where he was just an unbelievable runner that was hard to keep up with. JJ McCarthy could be legit, but the problem is with him is that we just don't have the sample size of instances where the game was on the line, where he needed to step up, everyone else was struggling, and he needed to be the guy. We don't have any of that. I think everyone has portrayed this as not a foregone conclusion, but JJ McCarthy, he's got the tools and the intangibles that you look for in a quarterback. So that means he's going to work out. But if I don't have the evidence on film outside of seeing a couple big throws and he looks all, fantastic and shiny at his pro day, that's all good and nice. But if I don't have it on tape, I can't really truly buy into that. Outside of that, Bo Nix could work out, just not super exciting, or, it doesn't really make these flashy plays. He's dink and dunk. And Michael Penix is very boomer bust if he does end up going in the first round, because of how big his arm is, but also how injury prone and really brittle he has been in his playing career. So there's a lot of really good options for some of these teams if they want to go a little bit later on. And it's going to be just continually such a highly debated conversation until the pick is going to, these picks are going to be in the end of April.
What's your order right now? Not what's going to happen, but what would you do? 1, 2, 3. What order would you put him in?
Caleb, obviously, to the Bears, best quarterback in this class. I think Jaden Daniels makes the most sense with the Commanders. Cliff Kingsbury talked about how Kyler Murray was the perfect quarterback for the scheme that he was trying to run when he drafted him. I think having the mobility is going to be strong and important for him. And then Drake May, if it's the Vikings, if it's the Patriots, would be the third one to go. He is going to be take a little bit more time to come along because of some of those decision-making issues that we see on film from time to time. But that to me is probably the likely path here for the top 3. And then JJ goes 4, depending on who trades up to go get him.
The First Team podcast, it's on the Bleav Network. Tell us about the show and what you guys got going on. I know it's real busy right now.
Yeah, make sure to check us out wherever you catch your podcasts, on YouTube, First Team Podcast, with me and my co-host Ryan Roberts, also on Twitter at the First Team Pod. And then you can also just catch me on Twitter at Joe DeLeone as we're finishing up our position rankings and we're getting ready to talk the big overarching questions. And the draft comes not too far away, a couple of weeks, 4 weeks, something like that. It feels weird how close it is.
Oh my goodness, I didn't even realize it was that close.
I might be a little off there. I think it's like 4 something weeks. It's almost April, so it's coming.
Man, it's always great to catch up with you, Joe. Thanks for the time.
Of course, Robert. Thanks so much.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.